Hello and good evening. Apologies for the late live. We've had some technical issues. It seems like Destiny doesn't want us to do this StreamYard. Maybe it's a plot by Labour trying to keep us away. But excited to be on. As always, just want to make sure that you can hear me properly, especially today, whereby we've had some technical issues with my mic here, which is not working. So a little bit different today. I have my AirPods, but the important thing is you can hear me, and if so, give me a thumbs up. And also, obviously, the video is very important as well, but I'm sure you can see me. Thank you very much, Andrew. Good to have you on. And today we are talking about, of course, rent caps by Labour and the potential impact that it can have in the rental market, and whether rent cap even work in terms of where they've implemented it in other parts of the world. So I have some interesting articles for you today, and I'm excited to share. So lots happened over the last week since we last jumped on. One of the most important things is, of course, if you've been following my channel and you've seen the recent video that we put on with Sadiq Khan, you will also know that he's been promoting, pushing rent controls, especially in the capital, for a number of years. But today we wanted to look at not from a perspective of the capital alone, but just over across the whole of the UK and where and how it would work if it is implemented. Now, a lot of people would say at the moment it's just speculation because we don't know what's happening. Yet a lot of it has been speculation, and then it does evolve to be true. So, such as, of course, we are approaching a point with regard to tax hikes, which started as speculation, and now Labour government has come out and said, actually, yes, we are going to have make hard decisions, and that's where we are at the moment. So, first up, let's look at this first article here, which is disastrous rent control leading portal hits out at politicians. One of the largest letting portals in Scotland is warning that plans by the government north of the border to introduce rent control will be disastrous. The housing bill currently being considered by the Scottish government shows no sign of backtracking from rent control, despite the fall from power of the Green Party, which worked alongside the Scottish National Party to introduce rent controls. And of course, this is the debate happening up north. But what I wanted to share with you was really what's potentially happening here in England. But I like to use this as a guide, where in Scotland, it hasn't worked out very well, as we can see here. In fact, as you can see here, the title says it all: disastrous rent controls leading portal hits at politicians. So as you can see, these rent controls that have happened in Scotland, we've seen a number of reduction in buy-to-let properties, a lot of landlords selling up. We saw the numbers even when we looked at the short-term rental. So short-term rental in Scotland, the amount of stock there reduced substantially. And that's potentially something that we're going to be seeing here in here in England as well. I have a sun in my face, so bear with me one moment as I bring down the curtain because it's really getting in my eyes. But the great thing is I do have my AirPods so you can hear me. So the last thing that we heard, especially when it comes to London, was that the mayor, Sadiq Khan, had been blocked. His plans had been blocked by Labour with his plans. So is this a victory? Is this a win? I think it's a win in terms of those landlords who didn't want obviously the rent controls in London. But overall, I think there's going to be a bigger plan overall around the country in terms of what rent caps, which is more specific than the overall rent control. So Angela Rayner stops mayor's plan to impose rent controls on landlords. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. So London Mayor Sadiq Khan appears to have lost his years-long fight to win the power to improve rent controls. Media reports over the weekend suggest that the new Labour government has made it clear that it will not be devolving the power to limit rent rises to metro mayors. So The devil's in the detail. We're talking about that they have confirmed that they have blocked the mayor in that they will not be devolving the power to limit rent rises to metro mayors such as Khan. But that's not meaning that the Labour Party overall aren't going to implement some type of rent caps. And that is the conversation we're going to have today. So all but one of England's metro mayors are Labour. So London media outlet says that a spokesperson for the Ministry of House, Communities and Local Government has stated that Housing Secretary Angela Rayner has no plans. This is no plans whatsoever to devolve rent control powers. Well, they are retaining the main power in central government. In the spring, before our general election, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer told the Local Democracy reporting service that rent controls were not Labour's policy at the moment, while admitting that Sadiq feels strongly about this and pledging to work together going forward. So lack of supply is fueling the housing crisis, and we are taking action to boost house building. We will work closely with the mayor and boroughs so we can increase housing delivery in London, which that's an important point, because looking at data, what I do know about housing in the capital is that it's always failed to deliver the amount of houses that's needed for the growth in the capital. Most recently, in the most recent years, we've had an increase of 2.2 million in population here in London alone. That's a huge number. And it's never been able to deliver the housing that's necessary to keep up with that growth. And of course, you have various factors contributing to that growth. Number one, you have that natural increase in the capital. But together with that, you've got immigration. Now, I'm not saying I'm against immigration in any way whatsoever. Immigration has its benefits. And in fact, the immigration that comes into the capital, a lot of them want to come in and want to rent for a few years before they go in and buy. So we need the talent, we need the professionals, and all that comes in. And yet it does put a strain on an already problematic housing supply here in the capital. And they want to, take that and put a rent cap. So let me give you an example of what's happened in Scotland. So in Scotland, the structure is that you are not allowed to increase the rent within a certain period of time with existing tenants. So what's happened is, unfortunately, again, this comes to cause and effect. What's happened is that unintended consequences is that whilst the property does not have a tenant in, you are allowed as a landlord to adjust prices to current trends, to current market trends. So landlords are asking politely tenants to leave after a certain amount of time, 6 months, 12 months, so that they can adjust those rental increases, which is interesting again, because everything has an unintended consequence. And we're going to be looking at how these unintended consequences have happened in other parts of the world. But we have found that there's evidence that in Scotland, tenants are having to move more than what they were before. And this is at the outset, as a result of those rent caps. Okay, we have this other article, which is where off landlord exit continues as even more set up. There's been a substantial rise in landlord exiting the market. Downside article for analysis by 20 EA has found figures show that the number of properties currently for sale that were listed to let in the past 3 years has risen dramatically. In June 2024, 18% of all properties listed for sale had also been listed for rent within 3 years prior to the sale of listing. So why is this important? It's important because the landlords that are selling up in the last few weeks or months to where we are now has been partly because of all the speculation of the tax hikes, but of course everything else that's happened before, but also with regards to the possible rent controls. It was an interesting article to look at in terms of rent control, and this was an article come out just last week. So rent controls almost all backfire, says free market think tank. So the Institute of Economic Affairs, a free market think tank, has undertaken an exhaustive review of rent control policies across the world and concluded that produce far more negative problems than actual benefits. It found that 56 to 65 examples of rent control did indeed lower rents as intended, but almost all produce unintended side effects such as deterring new homes built, reducing quality of housing stock, limited tenant mobility, and strategic misallocation and houses. So let me elaborate on that just a little bit. When we have areas such as London, which is a high cost of entry when it comes to buy-to-let properties, and there's already a high cost, including the price of the property, the stamp duty, obviously the higher the price, the higher the stamp duty. And when you look at also the amount of deposit that you need to invest, and then on top of that, as a buy-to-let investor, you now can't maximize on your return because there is a cap on that. That's going to move people away. So a couple of things are going to happen. Couple out of a few. So one of them is that it's going to deter buy-to-let investors even entering the market at all. I mean, if you have a cap as to how much return you can get on your property or on your investment, then that may not be the best investment. Whereas if you invest in shares, if you invest in businesses, if you invest in, dare I say it, crypto, there is no cap, but there is a cap in buy-to-let investment. Number two, people continue to do buy-to-let, then with that cap, the risk that they take in terms of the amount of money they pour in versus what they will return, they will start buying in areas that are more favorable in terms of price, not in high cost. So that's going to put a strain on the buy-to-let market in places like London. The IEA's research has been led by Dr. Konstantin, senior researcher at the German Institute of Economic Research in Berlin. And this is going to be interesting because we're going to be looking at Berlin and the rent controls that have happened there. So he's reviewed 196 studies undertaken over 60 years. They span almost 100 countries in all continents. And IEA says the briefing paper highlights the strong and enduring consensus in the academic literature about impact of the rent control, namely according to Colonlin, rent control benefits existing tenant. So rent control benefit existing tenants at a significant cost to the broader society. So again, this goes back to the example with the Scottish rent controls, which is it benefit tenants, existing tenants, for a period of time. But in fact, if we look at Scotland's rent increase, it's been substantial since the rent control were introduced. And that's been a complete failure. According to rent controls can also create excess demand for housing. This can result in new residents finding it difficult to locate places to live in, which decreases labor mobility, increases discrimination and against marginalized groups, and boosts black market activity. Oh, that does sound scary. So I promised I was going to give you some example in some areas where this has been implemented and it has gone horribly wrong. And so I'm going to share with you what's happened. One is in Sweden and the other one is also in Berlin. Let's talk about Berlin one as we're on the same topic. So for any of you who are just joining today, we are talking about rent control, rent caps, and will it work? And has it worked in other places in the world? And today we're talking about Berlin. We just talked about one researcher who said that it can go horribly wrong. It can benefit existing tenants, however, to a negative to the broader society. So Berlin's rent cap is illegal. Germany's highest court rules. So this is where the decision was taken to overturn the state law deals blow to campaigners' hopes of keeping city affordable. So the law was overturned. So Germany's highest court has ruled that a rent cap imposed by the Berlin state government is illegal, dealing a huge blow to those who have campaigned to keep the city affordable. It sounds very much like what's happening here in London, right? And what Sadiq Khan is pushing. Sadiq Khan is pushing for powers to be able to to limit rents increases, and Labour has not given in for now. And yet, if we look at what's happened here in Berlin, this could have been the story of London. So the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe overturned the law on Thursday, saying lawmakers in the state had no right to instigate the law, one of the most controversial and debated pieces of legislation in recent years. By the way, this was back in 2019, so it's not recent, but it it is for sure relevant. So this was in 2021. I remember, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2019, it was implemented in 2020, and rents were kept at the same rate as 2019. Let's look. The rent came into force in February last year, freezing the rents for 1.5 million, 90% of Berlin's flats at their June 2019 level for 5 years. Let me read this again, because I'm sure this is something that Sadiq Khan was wanting to put through. And if you're renters, tenants on this video, I understand and I appreciate that rent increasing at 35% over the course of 3 years is not sustainable. It's not good for tenants. It's not good for landlords either, trust me. And yet rent caps have a negative effect, which we've seen in Scotland. And if tenants are struggling at the moment in terms of finding supply, trust me, anything like this will be disastrous. And we've seen the impact of government intervention over the course of the last few years. I don't want to digress, but if you want to hear more about that, feel free to reach out on the comment. We can talk about tenant fees, banning. We could talk about other aspects as well. So rent caps in another 5 years. So let me read that again. Freezing rents for 1.5 million, 90% of Berlin flats at their June 2019 level for 5 years. New rents could not go beyond that level. And from November 2020, existing rents that were still above it had to be reduced. Let's see if we have any questions before we go on to a few more. Can you share any examples of rent control? Well, okay, yeah. So this probably before I just started to share. So those are examples of rent controls in Berlin. There's other examples as well in Sweden. Let me have it here. In Manchester, UK, the housing benefit got the market rent officers to value rents on every property and drop rents from £250 per week to £50 a week in 2008. Wow, okay, that's interesting. Thank you, more monkey business. How might the introduction of rent caps affect the long-term returns on property investments in the UK? Well, it would affect it hugely. Wise process. It will be disastrous for buy-to-let landlords, and it will be disastrous for buy-to-let landlords. I think that investors will look elsewhere, and I think that will have a horrible effect on tenants, especially for the short term. You know, if Labour does deliver 1.5 million within 5 years, and not even if they deliver that 1.5 million, by the way, because at this point they're playing catch up. Even if they did deliver, which they won't, even if they will deliver that 1.5 million, I'll be very surprised. It would not be enough. So maybe in 5-10 years, once they sort out the housing supply, which is the real issue, then potentially wouldn't have a negative impact on tenants. At the moment, if they do that, it very much will. More than what we're seeing at the moment. I hope that helps. So what other question we have? So anyone just joining us right now, we are talking about rent caps. We are talking about Labour potentially introducing these, and Sadiq Khan's push to give him the power and the control to dictate the rental market. So when we look at Labour, obviously Labour is a left party, and we see that they are very much pushing the right for Labour, people who are working and being able to control their money and being able to earn fairly. My question is, what about for investors? What about the freedom for investors? For them to say, if I invest, I want a fair deal. Where is that freedom? So just something to think about. So we were talking about Berlin's disaster and how it was overturned, the rent cap that they introduced, and the model was hailed internationally as a triumph by those striving to retain a social mix of cities, particularly in Berlin, where affordability has been one of its key attractions, but where rents have been soaring for years, fueled in large part of the hedge funds and private equity firms buying up properties. And that is another point, by the way, because one thing that we are seeing at the moment is the smaller buy-to-let landlords exiting the market. And we can see this by articles like this, we're off. Now, these who are saying we're off are very much smaller landlords. So the exit from the letting sector has been going on for significant volume for some 2 or 3 years now. Landlords realize the increased burden of conforming by tighter regulations and additional costs of activities such as council licensing, not mention high interest rates. So it's the smaller landlords are exiting the market, but guess what? It's the corporations, the institutions, and those hedge funds that are entering the market, such as John Lewis, insurance companies, banks, just to name a few. And so what we're going to find is these big institutions who are taking over the buy-to-let market. These are developers in terms of build to rent, and just overall those developers. Is that what the government wants? It seems like it. What is the benefit of that? I'm not exactly sure, and it's a good question and something to follow up on. So we have Andrew. Would be great to know if there are any alternative investment strategy or property types that might be of less affected by the rent control measures. I would love to share that with you, Andrew. Yet I am not a tax expert, or shall I say, investment advisor. So what I will say is buy-to-let continues to be attractive. Buy-to-let is not dead, despite everything the government is throwing at landlords. And it's very hard to find alternative investments that can match the rents rising together with inflation. It may lag, but rising together with inflation, rents being paid by your debt being paid by your tenants. Number two, capital growth, which is the big one. You getting that capital growth, but also being able to get cash flow. What dare I say it? Depending on where you buy and what you buy, getting cash flow by your tenant as well. I hope that helps. So this article is also very interesting and very similar to Berlin. So the pitfalls of rent restraints, why Stockholm's model has failed many. 500,000 or more on the waiting list for rent-controlled flats in Stockholm, meaning a two-tier system, bribes and thriving parallel market. I mean, is this the world that we want to be living in the UK, in London? Again, I'm all for rent being at a reasonable price because it's not good for tenants or landlords of the wider society. But caps and controls are not the answer. Supply, in my view, is the answer. But for the past 2 years, and let's look at the date on this, just to give this some context. So this was back in 2015. This was, I don't know when the actual control was implemented, but for the past 2 years, Victor and his girlfriend Louise have been sharing a studio apartment in Basatan, one of the most desirable areas in central Stockholm. Together they pay, okay. I consider myself very lucky to be in the situation I'm in. Okay, I'm not sure where. Okay, buy-to-let is almost unheard of. It's considered speculation, profiting from people in a way you are not supposed to, says Billy McCorm. It's a legally quite hard to acquire apartment and start renting them. You can sublet your rental apartment for a fixed period of time, but it's up to the landlord. So let's see if there's any other. So we've got Martin Pease, how could rent caps influence the relationship between landlords and tenants, particularly in negotiation and renewals? Well, the issue here, Martin, is that if there are rent caps, there is a mortgage challenge here, because when you come up to refinance your property and your rental property is not keeping up pace in comparison what the property is worth, inflation, everything else, you're probably going to be at its start. You're probably going to struggle to refinance your property because it's lagging behind market rates, and that will be based on that cap that you have with your existing tenant. So it wouldn't be a good outcome for buy-to-let investors, may I say. The best example I can really give is the Scottish example, the most recent one, and really just saying that buy-to-let landlords will look for other investments. That's just the fact of what would happen, unfortunately, in the current market. So thank you for everyone for joining me today, and do watch the Sadiq Khan London Mayor video that was recorded a few probably a week ago, which will give you a much better insight. If you was to call up your local rent officers who works on behalf of the council, the rents have already been reassessed and now it's coming in. Interesting. Thank you very much. So I'm just reading here one of the comments of our viewers, which is a scary point you're making there, More Monkey Business. So listen, guys, thank you very much for joining. It is a short one. We've had some technical issues, but thank you for joining as always. Much appreciated.